All right. Hello everybody and welcome to concurrent session 2B. Today we're going to be talking about psychosocial risk assessments, putting mental health first. Before we start, in the spirit of reconciliation, the IIA-Australia acknowledges the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and the connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people today. Look, thank you for being at this session. It looks like it's a very popular one today, so appreciate your attendance. Today we've got two wonderful guest speakers. We've got Dr. Laura Kirby, Chief Psychologist and Executive Director of Australian Psychological Services, and Nicki Makris. She is the Head of Audit and Operations at Woolworths there. So before I introduce Dr. Laura Kirby in relation to her presentation, I will just do a few introductions and provide a little bit of background information about these two wonderful speakers. So Dr. Laura Kirby, she is an organisational psychologist with more than 15 years experience working with organisations across Australia and globally. She specialises in workplace psychological health and safety, and Laura has designed, implemented and evaluated strategic workplace services to enhance the mental health and associated systems within organisations. Laura has held several senior and executive positions in corporate settings, focusing on enhancing the strategic approach to workplace psychological health and safety. And prior to joining the APS, she held the inaugural Chief Medical Health Officer role for the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. And we do have Nicki Makris as well, the Head of Audit Operations at Woolworths. Nicki is a commercially focused leader with over 10 years experience driving enterprise transformation and sustainable EBIT growth across diverse industries such as property, construction and fast-moving consumer groups. Her expertise bridges financial governance and strategic execution, combined with a strong background in operations, safety, internal audit, finance and procurement. So if you help me welcome these two wonderful speakers. And we have Dr. Laura Kirby to present first.
Thank you, everyone. Nicki and I were just discussing expecting a much quieter room this afternoon. Who knew this was such a great topic? I mean, I know it's a great topic, but I'm very biased in that domain. So thank you so much for spending time with us this afternoon to talk about psychosocial risk assessments, putting mental health first. I'm going to talk to what I had allocated in a very short amount of time, what I thought was really interesting about this topic. But the good news is there's lots of Q&A to be held once myself and Nicki have spoken. So if you do have questions, let's have a really good chat about this once we wrap up the actual formal presentation part of this. I thought it would be helpful to start with a lens that I think is sometimes missed when we bring up the topic of psychosocial risk assessments, and that is the why we're doing this in the first place. So starting with this view that when we are assessing psychosocial risk or hazards in the workplace, what are we effectively assessing? We are looking at basically any workplace factor that has the potential to cause psychological harm, whether or not it may also cause physical harm. So that is a very basic definition that we see in terms of what these risk assessments aim to assess. They typically come out of four buckets. The first is around the work demands, i.e. what are the sorts of demands, volume of demands, type of demands that we are performing on a regular basis in our work. What is the design and management of our work? What is the physical work environment, including the plant, equipment and technology that we might be utilising in that workplace environment as well as the social factors, the interactions that we're likely to have in the workplace and the types of behaviours that we're exposed to in that workplace setting. The reason that we want to take a look at these factors is that they have the potential to cause psychological harm. In other words, mental health harm. That means that people can experience, in the first instance, often what we describe as stress. Now, there's a small challenge with stress, and that is that it's not actually a mental health diagnosis or a mental illness diagnosis in and of itself. All of us experience stress, and in many ways, that is actually really helpful for us to perform. In the absence of stress, we're often bored or underperforming. And so we need that little kind of, fire in our belly, that ability to be challenged to really get our best selves in our workplace setting. So stress in and of itself is not the problem. When it becomes problematic is when it typically is far more protracted. People experience it for a very long period of time. That it is something that creates a potential significant level of stress, or it happens so frequently that we can't escape it. So when we talk about psychological harm, it's really this manifestation of stress over duration, frequency and impact, in addition to the potential for it to lead to physical impacts and physical harm as well. Now, I wanted to position that first because at the end of this is an individual or a human being who is experiencing this. And I think we often miss the human element of it. I also gave some thought to what conference am I at, and I don't mean to stereotype all of you in the room, but there are some numerical reasons as to why we need to care about this as well. The first of which is when we don't do this properly, it's very costly. Current estimates suggest that we lose about $6 billion in productivity in corporate organisations over any 1 year, and that's not even necessarily taking into consideration all the peripheral kind of effects that happen within organisations. If anyone's had to manage situations involving protracted, prolonged high stress, we know that it's not often just the individuals who are experiencing it, but there's a whole microcosm or an ecosystem that sits around it that has productivity implications. So when we don't get this right, huge cost implications. There is a lot of work happening here in New South Wales looking at our workers' compensation system as a result of it, quite aside from other risk factors or cost factors, which includes reputational risk, EVP risk, etc., etc. That's not the only reason we want to care about this, though. The other reason we want to care about this is the potential outcomes from a positive sense. The benefits that we receive when we invest in this space. Again, not just putting the human first, but also thinking about current estimates in terms of return on investment into workplace mental health practices within organisations currently shows a $4 return on investment for every dollar invested. Now, I think that's fairly low given what we know the impact can be. And in fact, UK estimates for some more recent research suggest that goes up to £6 per £1 investment. And so we're talking both at an individual but also team organisational level outcomes when we get this right. And so if I could position for you, the prospect of psychosocial risk assessments is how do we get work right such that the individuals, the humans experiencing it, experience a positive experience of work, benefit from their workplace, and thereby the workplace also receives similar benefits. Which is, from a utility perspective, really what psychosocial risk assessments are designed to achieve. Help us understand where work is no longer working well, and how do we fix it? How do we solve for it? There is kind of an element I haven't spoken to just yet, and I'm sure that most people would be across this, aside from the cost-benefit perspective, and that is that this is something that we literally have to do. There are very clear health and safety regulations and law in place that prescribes us to have to invest in creating psychologically safe and healthy workplaces in the same way that we invest in physical health and safety within our workplaces. The risk management model from a compliance perspective is what you've got on the left-hand side of this screen. And risk assessments play a really important role in us being able to meet that compliance, because that one tool allows us to identify the hazards that our people are experiencing, assess the impact that those hazards may be having, understand what controls we have in place to get it right or minimise the risk of harm, and allow us a way to metricate, measure, evaluate over time the efficacy of those controls. So it taps neatly into that full 4-step process that employers are required to undertake to create that safe and healthy workplace environment. Now that's kind of like, yeah, sure, that sounds really obvious. Sometimes it sounds really simple, unless you've actually done this, and you go, it gets real complex really quickly. So I thought with my time, I'd just spend a little bit of time focusing on where do I see organisations get it right, and where do I see organisations not get it so right. So if I take a look at one of the approaches to psychosocial risk assessments, which is all about how we use often existing quantitative data to inform the risk assessment. So here we're talking about often relying on engagement type surveys, which will undoubtedly speak to themes around psychosocial hazards. It may not formally assess all of the 14 to 17 different psychosocial hazards, depending on which regulation you happen to be within, but it gives you information around quantitatively how we're tracking here. Now, with that, one of the challenges that we have is if we are solely relying on instruments that were built not directly to test psychosocial hazards or assess what ones we're exposed to, we may not be capturing a full assessment around our psychosocial hazards. So it may not be enough to just look at our engagement data, which is where some of the more dedicated tools in this space can be really beneficial. However, my caution on that is if your risk assessment tools focus specifically and only on the exposure to hazards, we also aren't really understanding the full landscape when it comes to psychosocial hazards and risk. That is because the nature of psychosocial hazards are such that they interact with one another and they are often cumulative in nature, which changes that overall risk profile, and exposure alone will not be able to inform that. So I'll give you a really classic example here. And this is where I'm working with customer-facing, client-facing organisations who, by the nature of their work, would automatically assess their exposure to emotional demands as very high. And so your immediate response may be, well, we've got significant risk factor here. Until you get underneath the surface of that answer to understand that actually that's kind of why they turned up for work today. Partly what drives them in their work is that access to emotional demands. It's partly what they really find challenging and rewarding in their role. So if we were to take steps to try and eliminate emotional demands, first of all, we'd fail pretty quickly because we cannot eliminate that from the nature of those roles. But secondly, we're also potentially taking away some of the more rewarding, positive aspects of people's work. So exposure does not equate to harm. And so how we're using these risk assessments matters in terms of whether we're actually able to look at the interactive elements and, in follow-up to that, protective factors. A lot of the risk assessment tools focus exclusively on this hazard, tell me what that exposure looks like, instead of also giving consideration to what's protective about your experience of work. If we were to invest in creating a mentally healthy workplace, what are those resource factors that we want to pick up? And so to the extent to which we can use risk assessment tools to inform the protective factors, we're going to get much more beneficial information to inform that overall process. So that's my little spiel about quantitative, my little soapbox around quantitative data analysis. Obviously, we can really enhance the impact of some of these tools by also collecting qualitative data and information. And so this can add richness to insights. We can start to understand, at least at a high level, what the interactions might look like, where we invite people to share verbatim feedback, and particularly where we can start to build themes in different populations. So it's going to give us much better insights in terms of what people's experiences of work are, what are the areas that we really need to tackle first in order to improve that experience of work. Here we just need to give consideration to, are we tapping into that full assessment and piece and interaction as well? Are we using multiple sources of qualitative data? We often have many more sources than what we actually use to inform this picture. And to what degree have we been able to incorporate some of that thematic analysis alongside the quantitative analysis to inform that bigger picture? The really big bit on this page that I want to call out is the often missed opportunity to use psychosocial risk assessments to include consultation. So when we talk about consultation from a health and safety perspective, actually what we're trying to understand here is collectively what is that experience of work, but what do we have in place to improve people's experience of work, and what's getting in the way of a good experience of work? In other words, one of the best methods for understanding the presence and efficacy of controls is your consultation. Now, this is a bit, I know, specifically from a regulator perspective, it's front page. This is what they are looking to see. It's very clear in the regulations that employers are required to consult with their people. And so again, I would be using risk assessments as an opportunity, put the human first, understand what that experience looks like, to particularly inform that understanding of what controls do we have in place, are they actually working? And if not, Can we get them to help solve for it? Now, this is the final bit, I would say, in terms of that benefit of deploying effective psychosocial risk assessments, and especially as an organisational psychologist, you could give me a page of psychosocial hazards, and I could rattle off what good controls should look like. But it would not be informed by what's reasonable, what's practicable, what's actually going to make a difference. And so this is where even I, as an expert in this space, rely very heavily on employee consultation to inform what are the sorts of controls we should have in place to further mitigate this risk, so far as is reasonably practicable. So don't undercook the consultation and really leverage that opportunity to help shape and inform the solutions, which also then creates a good buy-in, that ground level buy-in of how do we collectively solve for this and what role do each of us play in improving people's experience of work. So if I could summarise this in terms of what a psych risk assessment is and what it is not, this is my little list for you, or checklist if you will. I think I've spoken to most things, but if I could just maybe summarise by saying the key things to look out for: making sure that we're assessing all of the potential hazards, the way that they interact, recognising that they don't equate to harm in and of themselves, but really looking at that full picture of what the psychosocial hazard landscape looks like. That we are understanding what controls we have in place, how effective they are, and what are the additional controls we might need that are actually going to make a reasonable difference to people's experience of work. The final piece I would say is just how do we revisit this from a continuous improvement perspective. And again, the risk assessment tools allow us to do this, but there needs to be good practice. And realistically, I think there needs to be more of an integration into BAU, especially for frontline leaders. I don't know if anyone's in a frontline leader position. We put a lot of effort on your shoulders in this space, but realistically, in terms of who has the greatest level of influence and control in terms of people's experience of work day to day on the ground, leaders play a really intrinsically important role there. So equipping them to understand, how do we make small tweaks? How do we leverage those opportunities for improvement? How do we take on those solutions to improve people's experience of work? And how do we encourage individuals to embrace concepts around job crafting so that they can take ownership of that improved experience of work? So many of these topics I could talk to for days underwater with a mouthful of marbles. So that's my very quick spiel about psychosocial risk assessments. Just a final thought in terms of why this matters. And I think it's really important to recognise that we don't just have that kind of compliance view and obligation, that when we talk about improving organisations as well as improving individual mental health, the two are intrinsically linked. They're mutually dependent. And so it's really important that we get this right with a view to improving people's experience of work to enable a place that we can all thrive and flourish. So hopefully you have lots of questions for me at the end. Otherwise, I'm going to pause and let Nicki take over. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. That was really insightful, and I loved how you linked it back to risk controls, something that every internal auditor is passionate about, so really appreciate that. I'd like to introduce Nicki Makris to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you. You're going to be a hard act to follow now, Laura. What I might actually do with my presentation is slightly pivot it, given that there is a bit of an overlay and double up. Now, what I find in audit is, yes, we have a responsibility to ensure that controls are operating effectively. However, to Laura's point, I think the success of an internal audit function goes beyond just checking the documentation. It's getting a true understanding of the topic that you're reviewing, speaking to those that might have the information that you don't necessarily have. I know within my own team, we always rely on SMEs within the organisation or someone that's external, and then that allows you to actually properly audit the controls that you're looking at. It's really important to go beyond the surface tick a box layer. It's our ethos actually in our function. You really want to make sure that when you're looking at that control, you truly understand whether it's mitigating the risk that you're looking at. So in my mind, we have a responsibility to make sure that the right controls are in place, but to ensure that the physical and mental health of those in our organisation are protected. And you can never forget the people element. I'm really quite passionate about that, given the construction background that I originally came from. And I have a question for those in the room. You know, if you were to speak to people in your organisation and if you were to survey them tomorrow, would they say that psychological safety is actively managed or is it just talked about? I think that's a really important element to take into consideration. So psychosocial risk has now been codified under Australian law. And obviously, as we're all aware, we play a very active role in managing emerging risks and making sure that we have the right controls in place to protect all of our organisations from significant legal, operational and reputational liabilities. We all report to the board, so we have a responsibility to make sure that the directors' liabilities are properly protected. So over to the next slide. So why does this actually matter to an organisation? You quite eloquently covered it off. However, for us, from an audit perspective, psychological health is actually part of our primary duty of care. So when you're looking at your risk assessments and from a safety lens, primary duty of care is something of a director's obligation. So policies are no longer sufficient. We need to actually make sure that organisations have a structured approach to assessing the risk, identifying the controls and actually making sure that those controls are operating effectively across the organisation and that it's actually reviewed on a regular basis. So we need to make sure that everyone is very well aware of what line 1, being management, is responsible for. Line 2, what is our risk function doing? What is our safety function doing in their space? And then that quite nicely leads into line 3, internal audit. When you're approaching it from an audit perspective, it's important to actually understand what lines 1 and 2 are actually doing. Where audit actually adds value is validating that lines 1 and 2 are actually operating effectively in line with the regulations and the requirements. But then line 3 comes in to try and identify where those gaps exist. And it goes beyond just looking at the framework that's been created. We should be able to look at that framework, properly look at the codified requirements with the standards and make sure that 1, does the framework actually align to the standards and the requirements? If not, obviously an improvement opportunity. But then 2, where we have those controls in place that have been documented, again, from an operational perspective, is it fit for purpose within each business unit that you're looking at? So from a Woolworths perspective, it's a really complex organisation. We have people at the storefront, we have people that work within logistics, we have people on the road, and there will be operational nuances that need to be taken into consideration when you're actually going out and checking the controls. That's where you add the value. So some important statistics, because as auditors, we love our numbers. So I actually found this really interesting. I Googled this for the purposes of this audit, just to understand the quantum and the value of mental health impacts on an organisation. And what I found really interesting, as you can see that I bolded, is that it's actually significantly outpaced physical health claims in terms of both volume and growth. And I found this really quite fascinating. It actually really plays into the fact that it is very important that it's been codified in law because it tends to drive the behaviours from an organisation. So at this point in time, and as you can see, mental health claims or compensation is significantly more significant than physical health. And I don't want to take away from the importance of mental health. It's not just down to a dollar value, but if your company runs a self-insurance plan, it's actually even more critical that you're actually managing it appropriately. So the framework has evolved. It used to be implied under health and safety. So we actually undertook a review in this space about 3 years ago, just to do a readiness review, and it hadn't actually been codified. However, now since then, SafeWork Australia has actually issued a model code of practice in 2022. So it's now moved from a nice to have to a must from a director's liability perspective and from an organisational risk perspective. And from an audit perspective, when you're baselining what your risk and controls matrix should reflect, the model code of practice is a really good baseline to start because that at a minimum should be covered. If that is not covered, you have risk. The regulators' expectations are now clear. I actually won't go over this again. Laura did cover this off in great detail, but if you have any questions in regards to this, we can jump over to it in the Q&A. Now, in regards to what is a psychosocial hazard, again, Laura did cover this, so thank you, Laura. I will jump. I'm not going to go on that one. But what does good look like? So in a mature organisation should actually be able to demonstrate psychosocial risk has been embedded into the enterprise risk management framework. So there tends to be an alignment in terms of the risk appetite. Typically, you would find that risk appetite is very, very low when it comes to safety, both physical and mental. So that should be something that is on consideration of your audit plan. You know, what does your audit plan cover? It should always cover the level 1 risk appetite, as in the lowest risk. You need to ensure that there's board visibility on a quarterly basis. Depending on how the organisation is structured, you may have people committees that feed into the audit committee, but nonetheless, you should see that there is a level of reporting in that place. It actually does show that it's something that is taken seriously and that it's reported through from bottom all the way up. There should be leadership KPIs aligned to safe work design. I actually find this a very interesting space to look at. You can sometimes, navigating this with the people team isn't always very easy, but one thing to look at when you're going across this space from an audit perspective is actually looking at, do leaders have KPIs that require them to align to both mental and physical safety requirements? That will tend to show you how seriously an organisation is actually taking this into consideration and would probably feed into your work and give you a bit of an indicator of what to look at. Is there an independent audit cycle? Again, coming back to the 3 lines of defence, how often is this looked at? Is line 2, for example, safety risk, actually looking at this? You'd like to think on a more regular basis an audit? And are there clear escalation protocols for any breakdowns in the controls or in this space? So why audit psychosocial risk? I think it's fair to say that policies are there, they're documented, doesn't necessarily mean that they're being followed. So audit actually have a responsibility to come in to, 1, look at the policy and the documentation, but to actually ask a number of questions which actually would allow us to then independently assess whether the organisation actually understands the risks that are involved, whether they have the right controls in place, etc. So again, to really emphasise this, where audit comes in, we need to make sure that we go beyond just looking at the documents and making sure that those documents have been operationalised, or policies I should say rather. The 3 lines of defence. Now, I think it's fair to say that everyone in this room knows what the 3 lines of defence are, so I won't go through this in too much detail. But nonetheless, from a management perspective, you know, making sure that they've done hazard and risk identification. If you go across into line 2, being safety or risk, looking at the frameworks, the oversight and the actual monitoring that they have. And then us, in terms of audit, providing the independent assurance that is required. I won't go into too much detail in regards to the step-by-step risk assessment that should be done, but nonetheless, this will give you a bit of an indicator of some of the documentation or processes that you should be looking at when you're auditing psychosocial health. What should internal audit test? So, for example, the existence of psychosocial risk registers. Do they actually exist? And are they bespoke to the organisation? So it's not something that they've just downloaded and it's just not necessarily fit for purpose. 2, risk assessment methodology consistency. Does it align to the risk functions methodology? 3, evidence of consultation. You touched on the importance of this, but make sure you actually do look at the evidence of consultation. And from a sampling perspective, depending on how complex your business is, you know, you'll obviously sample across different business units just to make sure that there is consistency in terms of practice, the way that they've done the consultation, and whether they've actually retained the documentation. The reality is if you were a third party coming in or a safety regulator, would you have enough evidence to prove everything that we're looking at this point in time? Controlled design quality, again, you know, if this is an area that you're not necessarily astute in, and this was the case for our team when we came in 3 years ago, look at the code. It always provides practical guidance. It's your first baseline that you should always look at if you need further information. The effectiveness of monitoring. This one is really quite important because, you know, your audit is at one point in time. You want to make sure that there is a continuity in terms of what they're looking at from a psychosocial perspective, both physical and mental, also for the safety. And are there reporting officers, so the obligations. Now, we talk to data analytics. Yes, data analytics are paramount. They're actually really important. And on the next few slides, I have some lead and lag indicators. However, the one thing I need to emphasise is check the data integrity. Data is only good as the quality that it is. We have found many, many times coming in to do an audit that you might look at the statistics and then realise that the quality of the data isn't necessarily right once you're actually going in and sampling. So before you invest a lot of time with the data analytics, make sure that the actual data itself is accurate, complete. Now moving on. We have metrics that matter. You all get a copy of this pack, but I've just got some examples of lag and lead indicators. You may not necessarily have these all available to you depending on the size of the organisation, but they are a few good examples of what you could find available. And then here are some red flags of the organisation in terms of what you could possibly be looking at. Now, the reason why I've provided this is, again, depending on how complex the organisation is, you may be able to use some of these data points to then determine what part of the business you may sample. Because, again, from an audit perspective, we always have limited time. So we need to make sure that our time in an audit matters. And then last but not least, I think this one's important, but I just want to leave this governance question for you all, because this is ultimately why we're employed and we're in the positions that we are in internal audit. So if the regulator attended tomorrow and actually requested evidence that we are proactively managing psychosocial risk, could we provide clear and documented proof of the hazard identification, risk assessment, control implementation and review? And if you can't necessarily answer that, you know that there is risk there. So I will leave that at that now for whatever questions you may have. Hopefully many for Laura and I, but thank you.
Thank you, Nikki. That was very insightful from an internal audit perspective. Now, if I could invite both of you ladies, Nikki and Laura, back to the stage if that's all right, for a little bit of Q&A. I do see a lot of familiar faces around the room. A lot from government here. I'm sure you've got a lot of questions that are burning into your brains. Also online, if you do have any questions, please lodge them through. I do have the iPad here. I hope it is working. I'm not very good at the technology. So we'll try to get those answered as well. But what I might start off with is, Nikki, can I ask a question for you? So you did mention that internal audit has limited time, limited resources. If you were going in an organisation doing your first psychosocial audit, where would you start with that and how would you build on it and how often would you touch back? Would it be each year? Would you skip a year? How would you approach that?
So look, it's not an easy one to answer, but I guess you need to take into consideration the size of the organisation and then the maturity of the area that you're looking at. So the way that we would approach it in our organisation, because it really is quite large, is potentially looking at phasing it. So for example, first, if it's not very mature in terms of process, coming in just to look at the design, it's essentially a readiness review. And then once you've given them a chance to then uplift the control environment, then agreeing to come back maybe 1 year, 2 years later to see if they've actually implemented those controls. And the other way that we'd approach it is from a phase perspective. Is this not on? Oh, I'm so sorry.
I can hear you.
I hope you can hear me.
Probably online.
My kids say that too. So, the other thing that I would be looking at as well is that I'm obviously not very talented. Sorry, guys.
Technology is probably
don't
not
use
our strong
microphones.
suite up here, so apologies.
Often. Okay. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay, sorry guys. And then the other way that I'd look at it is from a phase approach again, depending on the size, whether you need to chunk down the business unit. So that's where we as an audit function, for example, would use data to determine what we should prioritise. So we don't necessarily just look at the size of the business unit, we also look at data points to determine if there is a higher level of risk in a particular business unit before we select it.
Okay, and if I might move on from there in terms of the question, and this is probably for yourself, Laura, you did talk about, I guess, the effectiveness of controls and the fact that this is a people-driven type of role. Consultation is a big one to understand the effectiveness. From an internal audit perspective, are there tips and tricks that you can give us to provide us a bit of an insight where to look, how to question around those control effectiveness?
Really good question. Is that working? Psychologist and IT. So it's a really good question, and I think Nikki pointed to a really useful source material in terms of what do good controls look like, and that is the Safe Work Australia materials. Again, the New South Wales, Safe Work New South Wales materials, code of practice is really good. I don't often recommend that as really good reading material unless someone happens to have a particularly bad habit of not sleeping, but it gives some really good practical guidance, particularly the Safe Work New South Wales documentation, which has case studies at the back that illustrates how to put them into practice. My other caution around controls, and this is the biggest
kind of miss I see in terms of what's effective is the hierarchy of controls. And so we've applied that kind of lens from a physical point of view for some time now. When it comes to psychosocial hazards, we have often focused exclusively on the fix the worker, the kind of psychological equivalent of PPE, to manage hazards, i.e. have we got an EAP, have we sent people for resilience training because they're just not working hard enough or coping with the stress of the workplace, as opposed to looking at your higher order controls around good work design. So I would be applying in the first instance the hierarchy of controls lens, and by the way, there's many states and territories which require you to demonstrate how you've given consideration to hierarchy of controls as well as codes of practice, and some, in New South Wales here, it's now enforceable, the code of practice, wasn't previously. And then looking at some of the guidance material is what does good look like. The key question I use in consultation, though, is around how does this work in practice? Is this making a difference? Are we consistently applying these tools? And this is often one in the context of high job demands, which is probably one of the top 2 hazard areas that I hear about with organisations, which may or may not feel familiar. And there's some tools that are often in place, but it's are they actually working in the way that they are intended or designed? So it's getting an understanding of, is there still residual risk? And if so, are there additional tweaks, improvements, changes we could make to reduce that risk further? I don't know if that answers your
All right, thank you. And really, thank you again for talking an internal audit speak. We all understand exactly where you're going with that, so appreciate it. So what I might do, there's nothing online. Is there any other questions? Have one over here, and I'll repeat that.
Yeah, thank you. When it comes to individual cases, one of the things out of my experience, anything psychosocial, it's rarely one thing, it's rarely just work. It's often a complex interrelationship of, might be caring for aged parents, might not have a good family situation at home. Where does the line sort of start and stop in that, and how do you work through that?
Just before you answer that one, so for those online, that question is, in terms of psychosocial risks, it's normally not just one thing, it's a factor of combinations between work and home. Where is the line? Where do you start and stop with that?
I'll start and then you can translate into auditor language if that's okay. Fundamentally, what it will always come back to is show me what the system of work looks like. If you can show me that the system has been designed to mitigate risk, again, so far as is reasonably practical, I'm going to stop saying that because I assume you all know what I mean by that extra bit on the end that we always have to apply. But so long as we can show the system of work having been built to mitigate risk, that is kind of the main thing that the employer needs to demonstrate. I would add that we also need to give consideration to that when individuals raise concerns with us, we test the work system, but we also respond to the individual needs as well. So we might explore individual controls in that circumstance around how do we help that individual recover? What are some of the existing workplace controls, including maybe flexible work arrangements and those sorts of things, to help support that individual maintaining health, both physical and psychological. But from a requirement perspective, it is really that system of work, not necessarily how we've tailored every single aspect of work to our individuals.
I think what I'd just add to that is when we were going in and doing this review, and again emphasising that it was across many business units, did they have EAP available, speak up, ethics point, essentially an anonymous line that you can access, but is it visible? Is it on a workplace? Are people aware of it? Is this communicated regularly? Are there posters up in the offices? There are different things that we looked at in terms of the access points as well.
Yeah, and the multiple reporting pathways, how do people, yeah, yes.
All right, thank you. Any other questions?
Thank you for your talk. That was very insightful. We conducted a similar review regarding the whole implementation of the psychosocial framework. For us, it was bouncing around who actually the control ownership sits with.
Yes.
Because we've got the safety people that do the risk assessments, we've got the HR that sort of sits in the governance phase and management that needs to own it. It just keeps bouncing off each other.
Yes.
And nobody, not necessarily want to take ownership, but more are confused like what part is there. What's your insights on that?
So sorry, just before that, I think the question was around control ownership. Where does it sit?
Look, I'll go nerdy on this, and I have someone here from my team that's in the room, so she'll know that I always say this on every review, and it applies. RACEs. Responsibility, accountability. You know, when you've got a big organisation with many different teams that are responsible, that fundamental basic documentation is actually paramount, because then you can actually hold people to account. So I would have been, like, my recommendation there would be to clearly document that, make sure that there is that clear accountability and responsibility, and then hold them to account. And I know it sounds really simple, but it's actually quite critical in terms of them making sure that you're not running around like a headless chook.
I really have found my people. We do. It may surprise you, or may not surprise you rather. We spend workshops working through RACEs for that exact reason, is that left in isolation, people will bounce it around. And I can speak to experience in conducting a RACE workshop where we thought we had the right stakeholders in the room, which included health and safety and HR. And when we were delivering the RACE, the accountability went to directors every time. And I'm like, but who's doing it? And no one wanted to own the doing piece. So I think getting really articulate with, using that full RACE, breaking it down where you need to, and making sure it's clear who might be designing the controls, but the implementation is going to be in the work setting. So it does require that combined effort and that real collaboration around an agreement of who is owning what. Because then if you want to add the layer of when you're managing particular types of hazards, for example, harmful workplace behaviours, bullying, harassment, workplace sexual harassment, that one's been kicked around for a while now because it's traditionally been owned in P&C or HR environments. Health and safety need to now own part of the data as well. So it's a much greater collaboration effort when it comes to these pieces these days. But yeah, echo the RACE, love it.
So just to extend on that, obviously you've got as you said, you've got your director level responsibilities, you've got your control owner responsibilities that diverge down into management. How do you train people? How do you get the best out of them for them to understand, one, this is really important. It's basically on their heads, it's their liability. But two, what to look out for. So what is their responsibility? Are there things that they should be looking out for? How are they supposed to report that back to prevent and protect?
So it's a good question, and there is an element of training that needs to be done here. I know it's a lower order control, but if people don't know what they're doing, it's problematic. Obviously, director responsibilities and part of the officer due diligence, and I know you were talking to this before, and they need to be really clear on what that looks like and what their responsibilities are. When you start to talk more tactically with work teams, sometimes it's demystifying the language. And unfortunately, there is still, I think, concept conflation around things like psychological safety as well as psychosocial safety. They're two different things. Come to my TED talk on that for another time, but making sure people understand what we're talking about. There's some really great Safe Work Australia materials that speak to what do psychosocial hazards look like, and there's its little picture with speech bubbles, and people are saying things like, I'm overworked, I'm burnt out, I don't know what I'm doing, etc., etc. So the on the ground, what does this look like, is much more day-to-day items, and I'm yet to have run a psychosocial risk assessment that the key hazards weren't already known. It's just that we hadn't formally accepted that we've got these and built a really targeted action plan to address minimising those hazard areas.
So Nikki, from your perspective in an operational environment, how do you get comfort that your managers know what to look out for?
Again, coming back to the training piece and then the policies and the procedures, just seeing that they're there and then just seeing if it's actually been actioned. But as you go up, there's a different level of responsibility. So for me, I personally like when you can actually see it from ground up in terms of the granularity. So do people know from a store site environment, and then how does that manifest through? And then looking at the reporting lines as well and the actual reports that we've got coming through. So management should be aware of what's on the ground, but then they should be communicating it all the way up through to the directors. So yes, the directors have a fiduciary duty. They can ask questions at a board meeting. They can provide some level of advice on strategy, but they shouldn't be getting involved in the detail like management should, or even more senior management. But I do want to say something that pivots out of audit. It's the human element as well. It's just making sure that people don't forget that what we're talking about here actually involves human beings. And personally for me, it's always remembering that those that are around you do have both things happening at home and they may bring it to work. So you can't ever forget the human element. Like, yes, we're auditing it, but I think it's important that you always take it back to that.
Thank you.
I have a question. Do you think there is a case to actually rethink very clear in our hiring policies as to what type of values we are looking at the start, because I completely agree with you. Two people can react at the same situation in a different way. For one person it can be a stressful situation, for another person it can be business as usual. So are there any thought processes around rethinking our hiring procedures?
So just for those online, are there any thought processes around our hiring procedures and rethinking those to look at psychosocial safety?
Absolutely. And so one of the big areas of opportunity, I think, because not many people do it particularly well, is have we been able to articulate the psychological job competencies required to perform a role well, which might include some values-based assessment. It might also include some looking at the actual demands of the work that people perform, cognitive, physical, emotional demands, building good competency assessment around that and testing that person job fit from the get-go. What we don't want is to employ people that we're setting up for failure because they're not suited to the environment in which they need to operate. And so let me be clear, we're not kind of asking people, do they have a history of mental illness? That doesn't inform this whatsoever. It's, have we done the work to articulate what's required for success in this role from a psychological perspective and build good competency assessment around it? Absolutely, I'm a huge advocate for it.
All right, thank you.
Want me to shout it out?
If that's okay, thank you.
Something that I've come across is a situation where we had an employee saying that they were being exposed to psychosocial, but when you really looked into it, it was actually just performance management of someone not doing their job. In terms of how, from an audit perspective and filtering that out appropriately without bias, do you have any advice on that?
So for those watching on at home, that question was more around psychosocial safety claims versus performance issues in an employee, and is there any audit techniques to try and filter that out?
Look, from an audit perspective, you may look at those as sample on a...
Sorry,
I was listening for the audit answer. Okay. Look, this is a really big issue that I think we're facing, and I think we've got this real challenge around managers don't want to lead into performance conversations because they're worried about receiving a bullying and harassment claim. Up until now, typically the response has been, at least from a compensation perspective, if it involved performance management, it was automatically considered reasonable management action. Now they are testing more thoroughly, actually, how was that performance management delivered? Was it consistent with organisational policies and procedures? Did we take steps to improve performance before getting down to a formal performance management plan? So I think there are things that we need to do from a prevention point of view, which is often centred around, have we given really explicit role clarity? Have we set people up with really clear expectations for what performance looks like? Have we given early and regular feedback? I find a lot of the systems fall down at that point before we've even reached performance management. I do think we've got to do some course correction here though, because what we're finding is that just the performance management conversations aren't happening. So I think, again, I would come back to what does the system look like? Let's deal with the individual circumstances on a case by case, but it's the system around role clarity, clear expectations, regular feedback, normalising feedback, letting people know that we're going to have uncomfortable conversations at time if things don't meet expectations, but it's in the interest of helping people to perform. So yeah, it's the system that sits around it. Yeah. Do you want to add to that?
Look, all I'd just add from an audit lens, like as in elevating it up, we wouldn't be going down to that level.
Yeah.
It's not practical, so we'd be looking at systems and frameworks.
Yeah.
All right,
I was doing investigations, so it was at that level.
No, I had a feeling you might have been jumping into an investigation.
Yeah, and look, have we given leaders the capability to have these conversations? And so we talk about person job fit. I'm going on a rant now, but person job fit for leaders. So often we are still promoting people into leadership roles on the basis of technical competency without having that resonates, without having requisite people competency skills that fundamentally, if anyone's on a leadership role, the biggest challenge is the people. Speaking as a psychologist, it's my least favourite part about my job is people. But as a leader, it's the stuff that you have to face. And so unless we're setting leaders up for success, which includes giving them skills and checking they have the competencies to lean into uncomfortable conversations, to set people up for success from a role clarity perspective, to have regular check-ins and one-on-ones, yada, yada. So it is, I think there's a lot we could be doing to support our leader cohorts to lead this more effectively as well.
All right, unfortunately we've run out of time for any more questions. Look, I'd just like to thank Laura and Nikki. Really appreciated. You've got a fantastic presentation. You've given us a lot to think about, and I think there's got to be a lot of strategic internal audit plans for 26, 27 that might have psychosocial risk as a given priority topic. So we've just got a little gift from the IIA.